As we look at the history of life and we look at the fossil record, and we look at, we'll be going over separately, sort of geological time periods, some of the main events that happened. I already covered some of this from very old times in the past, kind of looking at the idea of prokaryotic cells going into eukaryotic cells through serial endosymbiosis, and then the eukaryotic cells forming multicellularity and so on. It's happening, a very, very long time ago. And then we get into breaking up, the more multicellular life into different stages. And so we're going to get to that, but separately, before we do that, what we're going to look at is, how do we know any of that stuff? How do we know this organism lived in this period of time? And it's because of the fossil record. And so you hear about fossils all the time, but really the question is, what is a fossil? How do fossils actually form? And then how do we know when they formed, or when that organism was once alive? So that's what this particular lecture is about, going over the process of fossilization and then how fossils are dated. And then separately, we'll kind of go through a little tour of history. So first off, what's a fossil? Well, a fossil is the remains of a living organism. So typically, it's been replaced by minerals. Mineralized remains of an organism. And there's a whole variety of different ways that can form with a variety of different types of minerals. And we're not going to go over everything. We're not a geology course, but we're going to give you some of the basics. Okay. Now, there are also different types of fossils in a much broader sense. So some fossils are evidence of an organism's activity in the past. Those are referred to as trace fossils. And so something like this, see here, this is a footprint, right, from a dinosaur that existed. This is actually from here in Connecticut. It's a relative of Dilophosaurus, and the name of the genus given to the one here in Connecticut is Eubrontes. But again, it's known from trace evidence. So an organism left this footprint behind, pulled it, from something that's at a state park, and so I could have my own, kind of copy of it. So I kind of did an idea of the fossilization process. One type of way that fossils can form is where organic material is in sediment. It's covered in soil. It's been covered with more sediment, and we're going to talk about this kind of more detailed a little bit in a second. And then the sediment is compressed into rock. The organic material decomposes, breaks away, and then it leaves a void. It doesn't collapse because that other outer material is hardened. All right, and so that forms a type of mold. And then other material seeps in, and then that hardens and it forms a cast, and you actually get two things. And that's kind of the process of making a mold and a cast with plaster. But that can happen naturally over time, as well. And so a footprint in soft sediment that then gets filled over by another type of sediment can then be preserved. And so that was the very rare case where that sort of thing has happened. But most of the time when we talk about fossils, we're really talking about more so body fossils, which is some part usually of an animal's body, not necessarily the whole organism. So a lot of times we're talking about bones and teeth for the most part, and then shells for a lot of invertebrate animals. But there are some cases where what were soft tissues of an animal can be preserved in a couple of different ways. Some is that they can actually be preserved through freezing, which is usually much more recent. So we'll get to hear about the time of the Ice Age, or the Quaternary period. And, so some animals might be frozen in ice. You actually have soft tissue. So that's not really fossilization, but it's a preservation, material. There's also preservation also in amber. So you might be familiar with that, of an insect getting trapped in tree sap, and then the sap then forms into an amber that hardens, and then that crystallized form preserves the organism inside. Anaerobically, the bacteria don't break it down, and then the tissues are preserved to be studied later on. Those are very, very rare, and it's usually from more recent organisms that have lived. So generally what we have is something like this. A process where, usually in water or around water, okay, so that's the first thing, that an organism in the water then dies and then falls into the sediment at the bottom. So here's the dead organism down here, representing the pink. I might have to replace that with something else because it's not working as good. But just, you get the idea here, okay? So there we go. That's a little bit better. So, now the thing is, here's all these conditions. Fossilization is very, very rare, right, for it to occur, and that's because there's a lot of conditions that have to be met. So if this organism dies and is eaten by other organisms, there's nothing left to fossilize. Okay, if it dies and then pieces of it are pulled apart and spread all over the place, again, maybe pieces of them are fossilized here and there, but won't be able to get a good picture, of that particular organism. So if the organism dies and then a short time after it dies, something happens. So it's near a river, and then more sediment gets washed in, from a storm, for example. And then this other layer then of sediment covers it. So now we have another layer of sediment covering it, so it's not going to get ripped up. Now it can be decomposed, so the tissue can start to decompose with bacterial action. So bacteria will start to break it down, and you'll often lose most of the soft tissues, but some of the hard tissues will remain. So shells of different organisms and teeth and bones will remain behind. There are also cases where the sediment traps the organism that's dead, and certain conditions are met where certain anaerobic activity, once it's anaerobic and maybe there's not anaerobic bacteria there to carry out breakdown, and so the tissue is slowed down in its breakdown process, and then other sorts of mineralization processes can actually preserve the soft tissue. That's also incredibly, incredibly rare, yet we do have samples like that from way back in the Cambrian period, around over 500 million years ago, that show actual soft body organisms in fossils of an area called the Burgess Shale. So we can actually see a good picture of what we'll talk about later is the Cambrian explosion of soft-bodied marine animals, and really a great diversity, a great explosion of animal diversity at this period of time, specifically because of that unique process. But that's not common. Okay, so commonly what happens is, again, sediment covers the dead organism. More sediment often covers that as well. So you have layers, and layers, of sediment. And again, this kind of just adds to pressure. Pushing down on it, heat, and time. Those are not as clearly written. That's why I usually have pre-write some of the stuff. So pressure, heat, and time will eventually starts to, compress some of these sediments into rock. So the rock will form. Now, depending on the type of sediment it was itself, so clays are going to help. Very fine sediments are going to preserve a lot more detail. Sand is going to provide a lot less detail, but still a decent amount of detail. So the coarser the grain, the larger the grains, the less detail obviously will be preserved in that. In addition to that, the time that it takes place will also have something to do with the materials that are decomposed and how fast they're being broke down and how fast they can be replaced and what can actually be seen in the fossil. So we'll talk about that now a second. So what happens in the actual fossilization process? Well, we have a couple different ways or different terms that people talk about. So one term is this one here, permineralization. It's usually one of the most common ones. So in permineralization, what happens is that water-containing minerals, so minerals get pulled into pores into the tissue that's there. So let's say it's a shell. So the soft body of the organism is broken down and decomposed. The shell is still here. And then if you were to look at this under a microscope, you would find that within the shell there are little holes and little pores. And so minerals get in there and then start to crystallize. And then that crystallized form within the remaining shell material starts to preserve the organics that are left before. So in permineralization, you have mineralized water crystallizes in these pores, and then it traps some of the organic material. A secondary process can then occur, which is often referred to as replacement. And in replacement, what happens is then any of the original material that was there is then broken down further, but while that happens, it's being replaced by other minerals. So all organics are replaced by minerals. And so the whole entire thing becomes stone, essentially. So whatever was there is all some type of rock and mineral. And so the shell then is no longer there, but you have a replacement form of the shell that we call the fossil. And so that's sort of something that's very very common. Now, the types of minerals that we usually find in doing this process, usually it's either calcification or silification. Okay, so those are really the two. You have calcite or silica as the minerals coming in to replace the other material and then form into the remaining fossil. Right, so it's formed of those types of material depending on what was, what's available in the water and the sediments and all those sorts of things. So it's a variety of different types of conditions that have to be met. There's also a much more rare type of occurrence called pyritization. It's because we're talking about iron pyrite. So this is something that's very rare and very slow, where we have pyrite. And sometimes some of the softer tissues of some organisms can be preserved with this type of process. But again, it's something that's fairly rare. So again, there are a variety of different ways. There's different kinds of minerals that can happen, but generally what occurs is that some minerals get into pores and then they solidify into crystals, and then that might be it, and then you have some of the organics left behind, and we might find those in some of the more recent fossils. But then as fossils get older and older, then those materials are broken down and then get replaced with other minerals completely, all right, through with silica and calcite and other sorts of things as well. So the next question would come is, so we end up finding a fossil. So how do we find a fossil? Because this is buried. The idea is it's buried now. Well, again, this is a whole geology thing, but there are shifts in the Earth's crust. So some layers then move upward, other layers get kind of pulled downward, and they slide across one another. And eventually, at some point in time, this sample here, I guess it's pulled away, and this gets exposed to the surface. Okay, and then so someone comes in, they chip away at this rock, and then they find the fossil that's there. Well, then they want to find out, when was the fossil from? Okay, so get into dating of fossils. If well, if we know the dates of layers of the fossils, or layers of the rock, for example, then we can do what's called relative dating. So, here we go, relative dating. Relative dating is essentially saying, so we kind of have an age here and an age, we know this one's below it, so it has to be older than that. So we do have, again, these two other terms. I believe I talked about them in other lectures as well. But stratigraphy is simply just there are layers of rock based on how old they are. And so that's the law of superposition, says that the layers closer to the surface are younger, and then the deeper layers are older. So if we know the date of this layer and this fossil's found below it, it is somewhat older than that particular rock. And that's just kind of relative dating. But we want to know for, how old is it actually? So we do then what's called absolute dating. Absolute dating is where we use radioactive isotopes to find out the age of either the fossil or the rock that the fossil was found in. So isotopes are essentially different versions of an element, versions that contain different numbers of neutrons. Right? So certain elements will decay or change over time, and they can decay from one version to another. So carbon, for example, is supposed to have, defined by having 12 protons. The number of neutrons can then change and form isotopes. So carbon, now this is our normal carbon, 12, can then become carbon 14. So it still has the 12 protons, but now it has 14 neutrons. So it's not the same, because this one has the same number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. They're all 12. Here we have extra neutrons. So this is the isotope here, the C14. What happens is that the isotopes decay over time. So that means they eventually change, and in this particular case, the carbon turns into nitrogen 14. And that is known to take a very specific amount of time. And I'm going to actually, because I want to add information to this, I'm going to redraw this just in a slightly different location over here. So the C14 is the isotope. What will happen is it will decay. So the decay product is nitrogen. And then there's a certain set, like I said, a set amount of time, which is called a half-life. So it's the amount of time it takes for half of the carbon 14 to change or turn into the nitrogen 14. And for carbon, it is 730 years. That's not actually all that long. Okay, it's only 5,000 years. So this is really only used for much more recent fossils, and it can usually only be used to date fossils that are from, usually around, you often see like 50,000 years, but usually it's like 50 to 75,000 years old. So not very old, actually. So those are things that have organic material still found in them. So much, much more recent sorts of things. So how else do we then age them? Well, other elements, other isotopes. So another one that's very commonly used is potassium. So potassium 40 then decays into argon 40. That has a half-life of 1.25 billion years. So now we can cover kind of a much greater period of time. And then you can see some of the much older fossils and get their dates from them. Also, uranium, you'll sometimes see there's 235 and 238 that are often used. Uranium 235 turns into lead, which is Pb. 207, and that has a date of 704 million years. So you can see different elements decay at different rates, and so we can use different elements depending on the type of rock that's there, because some of them might not be present in certain types of rock. So the potassium will be found in rocks that have certain types of minerals in it, and then can be used to do a lot of the dating. So essentially it's a sort of physical, chemical process where they look at the rock and then can actually get a date based on ratios of the different elements and their isotopes. And it can get a fairly accurate idea of how old they are. So that should give you at least some idea of fossils and their formation. So essentially the material has minerals pumped into it, and the minerals crystallize around organic material. That's called permineralization. And then the organics can often get replaced with other minerals as they continue to decay over time. And then you have this whole thing that's left behind that is all some minerals, some type of stone. And it all depends on what kind of sediment it was originally in as to how detailed it might be, how slow the process was, what kind of minerals there, how detailed the fossil was. In addition to that, to get a whole body in one place without organisms spreading it apart or breaking it up is also very rare, but these fossils do exist. That's why they're often very valuable, not just for money, but they're valuable to science, to study them. And then how do we know how old they are? It's looking at isotopes, so looking at ratios of certain elements as they radioactively decay over time in the rock, and then we can get a feel for, which one's older than another fossil, or kind of put it in a particular time period. And that's what we'll kind of get to next, is just a little tour through the time periods, and now you have this as a background to how do we know this? So how do we know this time? These things happened at this time period. This organism lived in this time period, and it was that old because of fossils were left behind, and the fossils were dated, and we placed them at these certain periods. And so that's kind of the next thing we'll get into.